So the RX 480 has been out for a little bit under a month now, and there are plenty of in-depth reviews to go along with the card, but the one question still remains, and that is what bottlenecks the GPU. So with me, I have 4 different CPUs that I am testing along with an i7 6700K to see what bottlenecks this GPU in a variety of games. So let's find out. Alright, so I have 4 different CPUs, all from different generations. I have the i5-3550, which is an Ivy Bridge CPU. I have the i7 6700K, overclocked to 4.4 gigahertz. And then I have the X3450, which is similar to an i7-860, which is the first generation i7s. I have that at stock, and I also have it overclocked to 3.6 gigahertz. And then from AMD, I have the FX6350. So let's start with the synthetic benchmarks. The very first one being Unigine Heaven 1.0. And as you can see, between all 4 CPUs, the differences is pretty minuscule. The i7 was the very first one, coming in at 2203, and then the Xeon X3450 at stock was the slowest at 2066. But again, these differences are very nominal. The RX 480 was definitely not an issue here. In 3D Mark Firestrike, you can see a way bigger difference than in the Unigine Heaven. The i7 again came in first at the 10,000 mark, and it was the only one to get that extra 0 in there. Everything else was under 10,000. The i5-3550 was pretty close to the i7 6700K, and the Xeon X3450 overclocked to 3.6 gigahertz was even closer to the i7, and I think that's because of its extra threads. It really helped out in the physics benchmark, at least. As you can see, the FX CPU is coming in dead last, and there is a pretty big difference between that and the i7 6700K, but again, this is only synthetic. When it came to the graphic scores, they were all pretty identical, maybe like 10 to 15 points difference between all 4 of the CPUs. So I will say that most of this is attested to the CPU intensive side of 3D Mark. Let's go on to the actual gaming benchmarks and see what the verdict is. When it came to Dirt Rally at 1080p ultra settings, there wasn't really a difference between the i7, the 6350, and the i5, even when it came to minimum FPS. The biggest difference between the CPUs was the i7, the 6350, the i5 versus the Xeon X3450. As you can see, there's a little bit of a difference there, especially in the minimum frame rates in the Xeon X3450, though when I did overclock it from 2.6 to 3.6, I did get a closer score to the other 3 CPUs. So now we have Metro Last Light Redux at 1080p on the very high preset. As you can see, between the average FPS of all 3, there isn't much of a difference. They're pretty identical, but if you look at the minimum FPS, you will see that there is kind of a big difference across the board between the CPUs. All of them really take a hit, and they cannot maintain 30 FPS consistently with the RX 480. But as you can see, the Xeon X3450 overclocked took a really big hit, and I'm not sure if that's because of stability or anything, but as you can see, there is a difference between that and the rest of the CPUs. The 6350, the Xeon X3450 were definitely behind the i5 and the i7, but again, the differences between those 2 and the i7 aren't too huge. So when it came to Shadow of Mordor at the very high preset at 1080p, the average frames per second between the CPUs were pretty similar. If you look at the minimum FPS, you'll see a bigger difference between the 2. The Xeon X3450 at stock really took a hit here, as it was more than 20 FPS behind the i7 overclocked at 4.4 gigahertz. Now, when I did overclock to 3.6, as you can see, it hit about 60, and it was able to maintain 60 throughout the benchmark, similar to the FX6350 at stock. The i5 held its own very, very well and had a higher average FPS than the i7 itself when it was paired with the RX 480. The minimum was a little bit lower, but overall it was still a pretty smooth experience. And the very last game we have is GTA 5. I ran this at maximum settings with no anti-aliasing at 1080p. The i7, of course, is leading the pack at 4.4 gigahertz, but the i5 is not too far behind, and the only real difference is in minimum FPS, but even then it was able to hold over 30 frames per second on average with the minimum FPS. Now, the Xeon X3450 was definitely the slowest when it came to average FPS, but it was very close to maintaining 30 FPS throughout the entire benchmark. Now, when I overclocked it to 3.6, I did get 60 FPS average, but again, I got that instability, and this is the second game where I've seen that instability there. So I'm not sure if my overclock is wrong. I did test it and stress test it, but maybe it's just an issue with newer titles. When it came to the FX 6350, it did average 50.15, but it was a little bit choppy and it had a few jumps here and there. As you can see, the minimum is 8.2 FPS, which is way lower than any of the other CPUs other than the Xeon X3450 overclocked. So what's the final verdict here? I will say that if you have a Sandy Bridge i5 or i7 and anything past that, then you'll be perfectly fine with the RX 480, even at stock CPU settings. Now, if you have an older i7, I definitely recommend overclocking it because you will get a little bit more performance out of that since the scaling is pretty good. Now, if you have an FX CPU, I would just say work with what you have. You'll be fine for the majority of games, but with any newer AAA titles like GTA 5, Rise of the Tomb Raider, or anything that's CPU intensive, you will see the FX 6350 struggling quite a bit. All right, guys, so that's it for this video. Sorry for not posting it any sooner. I've been kind of sick the past few days and I've had some issues at work, but I'm all better now and I'm hoping to get back into the swing of things as quickly as possible. I'm expecting to do a giveaway in the next month or so, so definitely be on the lookout for that. And I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.